Well, hey there and welcome to Unit 8 of the AP US History curriculum. So, at the end of Unit 7, I mentioned that America emerged from World War II as the most powerful nation in the world. And in this unit, we're going to see what we did with that power. So this unit covers the period 1945 to 1980. And as we go through it, we're going to consider America's involvement in the Cold War, which was kind of a war, not war with Russia, which defined dang near everything in this period. We're also going to consider the rise of a new civil rights movement. And to round things out, we're going to finish with the post-war demographic and economic changes. And if you're anything like me, all that sounds incredibly juicy and exciting. Oh, am I the only one? All right, so let's begin with the Cold War. Now, after the end of World War II, everyone, not surprisingly, longed to return to normal. But even before the war was over, the growing tension and mistrust between the US and the Soviet Union was going to take a giant steamer on that drain. First of all, let's get a definition. What is a Cold War? Well, basically, it's a conflict between two belligerents in which neither engages in open warfare with the other. Sort of a long-standing tension that could lead to a war at any moment, but it never really does. Now, as with everything, it's a little more complicated than that. Even though there was no direct fighting between the US and the Soviet Union, there was plenty of indirect fighting, on which more later. But first, we need to see how the Cold War got started. So, FDR died in his fourth term as president, then Harry Truman took office and oversaw the final negotiations for the World War II peace settlement, and he's the one in power as the Cold War begins. So, as I mentioned, the Cold War was centered around the rivalry between the two nations that emerged from World War II with the most power, the US and the Soviet Union. And the clash was very much centered around the dominant organizing ideologies of these two nations. The United States was democratic and capitalist, and the Soviet Union was communist. Now, you may recall that these two powers were actually allies in the fighting of World War II, but not because they were buddies. It was actually a partnership born out of a practical necessity to stop Hitler's aggressive expansionism. And so the mistrust and suspicion between these two nations began even before the war was over. At several conferences before the end of the war, both parties agreed that Central and Eastern European countries would hold free elections after the war was over. But Stalin went ahead and decided to keep those countries under Soviet control to act as a buffer zone between Russia and Europe. And you can hardly blame the guy. I mean, he was tired of his country getting invaded by European crazy men who wanted to own the world. And so in short order, those Central and European countries became communist and then served the purposes of the Soviet Union. Now, of course, the US saw this as a flagrant violation of their agreement to allow these nations the right of self-determination and democracy. One point in the mutual distrust column. And then the mistrust just expanded with the post-war handling of Germany. So the treaty that ended the war divided Germany into 4 occupation zones, each occupied by the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French, respectively. Now, this partition was meant to be a temporary measure, but the eastern section, dominated by the Soviets, quickly became another communist state. Add to that, the Soviets wanted to keep Germany weak, which would make them less of a threat, and they wanted to extract reparations from them to pay for all the damage that they caused during the war. But this was the exact opposite attitude from the one held by the Western powers. They wanted economic recovery for Germany because they saw such recovery as a key to a stable Europe. But regardless, the Soviets tightened their fist on East Germany, and it was clear by now that there was a significant ideological and political division in Europe. And it was the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill who gave it a name when he said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Okay, back to America and the policies we established to deal with the spread of communism. The main push with respect to communism was the policy of containment. You see, both democracy and communism have seeds within them that want to expand throughout the whole world and remake the world in its own image. So, understanding this, Truman took measures to contain the spread of communism, and this commitment became a significant piece of what became known as the Truman Doctrine. This doctrine said that the US would provide military and economic support to any nation threatened by the spread of communism. Now, the first implementation of the Truman Doctrine was the US support of Greece in the midst of a communist uprising there, and in response to Soviet demands for control of the Dardanelles, which is a water route in Turkey. And US support for these causes garnered bipartisan agreement in Congress, and they allocated $400 million in economic aid and military support. Also related to containment was the Marshall Plan, and because the communists seemed to have a good plan for supporting people in war-torn countries that were struggling to rebuild, the US feared that people would indeed adopt communism. Enter Secretary of State George Marshall. He proposed an extensive economic aid plan to help European nations rebuild and revive their economy. And the rationale behind this offering was that if nations had a healthy economy, then they would opt for democracy rather than communism. It's like when you taste the first drop of that juice from that sweet democratic mango, baby, you just want to crush it and keep drinking. So, all that said, $12 billion in aid was approved under the Marshall Plan, and as European nations began using it to rebuild, the plan actually worked. They chose democracy. Also important with respect to Cold War policy was the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This was a military pact created for the defense of Western Europe, and so here we see that the containment policy caused the buildup of American military in other parts of the world. And the Soviets, not to be outpacted, formed the Warsaw Pact, which sought to do the same thing for communist nations of Eastern Europe. Okay, now moving out of containment territory, let's mention a few other measures of the Cold War worth noting. First, the Cold War prompted an arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. This was just a race to develop superior weapon systems, and it got a little crazy. Remember that the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb at the end of World War II, so the Soviets responded by testing their first atomic bomb in 1949. Then, not to be outdone, Truman approved the development of a hydrogen bomb in 1952, which had about 1,000 times the destructive power of the atomic bomb. That's why I have a bomb that can kill tens of thousands of people when you can have a bomb that can kill hundreds of thousands of people. Am I right? In response, the Soviets tested their first hydrogen bomb the next year. Now, in one sense, this was very scary on both sides, but in another sense, there was some safety in this escalation of weaponry. It quickly became apparent that if either side launched one of these weapons against the other, it would provoke retaliation that would result in mutual assured destruction, and that had a way of keeping their fingers off the button. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was no direct fighting between these two powers, but there was indirect fighting, and the first example of this was the Korean War. So Korea was formerly a colony of Japan, and after World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviets occupied the north, and the US occupied the south, and then in 1949, both war. So Korea was formerly a colony of Japan, and after World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviets occupied the north, and the US occupied the south. And then in 1949, both powers withdrew from Korea, and surprise, surprise, the north established itself as communist, while the south established itself as democratic. So in June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and because the democratic communist ideologies were at stake, this immediately became a proxy war for the United States and the Soviet Union. Truman applied his containment policy to the situation, and the United Nations sent troops to support the South, but basically the forces were overwhelmingly American. In the opening of the war, North Korean forces pushed the UN forces all the way to the southern tip of the peninsula, but under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, they pushed the North all the way back to the Chinese border. However, they failed to heed Chinese warnings that they would send troops to defend its borders if the UN forces didn't back off. They patently did not back off, and so the Chinese forces overwhelmed the UN troops and pushed them right back down below the 38th parallel. And in the end, it was basically a stalemate along the same line where they started, with massive collateral damage levied against the civilian population in its wake. And that's how the Cold War went. It fluctuated between periods of indirect military engagement and mutual coexistence, or détente. The military engagement is going to heat up again in Vietnam, but we're going to save that one for later. But for now, let's see how things are going on over in America proper over the course of the Cold War. And here's where we get to talk about the Red Scare. Now, remember the Red Scare after World War I? Well, there was a second Red Scare during the Cold War. There was a general fear among Americans that communist spies had infiltrated American society at every level, including the highest levels of government. And so in the House of Representatives, the Un-American Activities Committee cranked into high gear searching for communist influence in American society. And they not only tried to sniff out communists in the government, but also in organizations like the Boy Scouts and film companies in Hollywood and even the Army. And this hysteria reached a fever pitch under the influence of a Republican senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. And in a speech he delivered in 1950, McCarthy claimed that he had a list naming 205 communists working in the State Department. And McCarthy rode this wave of fear to greater and greater power and influence. But under the growing pressure to prove these grandiose claims, McCarthy crumpled, and his meteoric rise to prominence was matched by a precipitous plummet from the spotlight. In 1954, the Senate held televised hearings called the Army McCarthy hearings, and when McCarthy was unable to prove his claims, the Senate voted to censure him. But it wasn't all crazy senators and communist hunting on the home front. There's lots of good stuff happening too. All right, well, let's talk higher education. Now, in 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act was passed, also known as the GI Bill, and it gave veterans of World War II the opportunity to go to college on the government's dime. And over 2 million veterans took them up on that. And veterans also received $16 billion in low-interest government-insured loans that they used for housing and businesses. Also, there was a baby boom, which refers to the post-war explosion of babies being born. And just to give you a sense of the scale, between 1945 and 1960, 50 million people were added to the U.S. population. That's a lot of babies, right? Now, all this led to an increased demand for housing construction as well, and most of the growth took place in the suburbs. A significant milestone in the development of the American suburb was Levittown, conceived and built by William J. Levin. And basically, it was just buttloads of mass-produced, low-cost homes in New York organized into identical lots, and just like think an assembly line for sprawling neighborhoods. And this kind of project was repeated in many places across the country, and one of the significant effects of suburbanization in America was that the majority of the middle class moved to the suburbs, leaving the urban areas poor and racially divided. And speaking of moving, there was also a spike in internal migration during this period. All those middle-class folks rushing to the suburbs left the northern states to find their suburban paradise in the Sun Belt states in the south and in the west. And they did it because the north is butt cold and the Sun Belt was warm. Additionally, they moved to pursue economic opportunities, especially in the defense industry. And as a result of this migration, the Sun Belt states became a powerful economic engine for the nation, as well as an increasing influential voting bloc. Also, we saw the further rise of mass culture during this time, which became increasingly homogenous in the post-war years. And there are many causes for this, but I'm only going to mention two. First was the proliferation of the television, and the TV quickly replaced radio as the chief entertainment device for Americans. And by 1961, there were something like 55 million television sets in American homes. And programming was dominated by a few networks who produced sports programming and comedies and variety shows. And the big takeaway here is that because so many people were watching the same programs, it provided them with a common language and cultural norms. Second was the further rise of advertising. Now, the advertising industry was born during the Industrial Revolution, and it's during this period that it enters its golden age. Aggressive advertisers began to appeal to Americans' emotional needs, and it worked because there was a huge boom in consumer spending. And the advent of credit cards in the 1950s made it easy for the average consumer to do that spending. So not only was culture being homogenized because of television programming, but now with national ad campaigns, we were all buying the same stuff. However, against this homogenization was a notable rebellion from artists. You had novelists like J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye. The protagonist is a troubled and cynical teenager by the name of Holden Caulfield, whose profound distaste for phoniness expressed Salinger's disgust with the blandness of American culture. Also, we had the beat poets, or the beatniks, and giving voice to this group was Jack Kerouac, who wrote free-form poems that did not conform to standardized poetic meter. And beatniks further rejected conformity by using drugs and rejecting societal norms of behavior and dress. Okay, now let's turn our attention to a very significant movement going on at home during this period, namely the Civil Rights Movement. So President Dwight Eisenhower took office in 1953, and he was busy containing communism, on which more later. But at home, events were taking shape that would revolutionize race relations in America. So recall that in the 1950s, racial segregation was still the law of the land, but especially so in the South. Thanks to the 1896 case Plessy versus Ferguson, blacks and whites were kept separate in schools and buses and public facilities and dang near any other way that they could think of. And with all the American bluster over the fight against communism and the triumph of freedom for the world, this glaring racial inequality stood in stark contrast. One of the early victories for the Civil Rights Movement was the overturning of Plessy in the case called Brown versus the Board of Education, and the argument was that schools, by virtue of being separate, were inherently unequal. And that argument was based on the 14th Amendment's provision for equal protection under the law. So, in 1954, schools were to be integrated. But as you no doubt could have guessed, this decision ran into some pretty stiff resistance in the segregated South. A bunch of Southern congressmen issued the Southern Manifesto, which argued that the Supreme Court had engaged in a gross abuse of power. Some states resisted by shutting down schools. In Arkansas, the governor called in the National Guard to prevent black students from entering Little Rock High School. Eisenhower then countered by sending federal troops to protect those 9 students and guarantee their entry. All this to say, the school integration effort was excruciatingly slow, not least because the court didn't mandate an enforceable timeline for integration. A decade after the Brown decision, only 2% of Southern schools were integrated. But while all that's going on in the schools, there was other work to do. So let's go check in with the movement in Alabama. In 1955, civil rights leaders organized the Montgomery bus boycott, which attacked segregation on public transportation. The boycott was brought to life the moment Rosa Parks, a black woman and an NAACP activist, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger, and her refusal became the impetus for a large-scale bus boycott and massive demonstrations for equality. And it was during this boycott that an Atlanta preacher by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. rose to prominence as one of the most powerful voices for this nonviolent movement dedicated to civil disobedience. And civil disobedience was further applied to the sit-in movement. Black folks by the hundreds, and mostly college students, sat at segregated food counters and refused to move until they were taken out by force and jailed. And as the jails began to fill up and as the public transportation system ground to a halt, segregation laws were slowly overturned. Perhaps the greatest moment of this movement, certainly the most visible, was the March on Washington in August of 1963. Hundreds of thousands gathered for a peaceful protest in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and this gathering provided the occasion for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, in which he made magnificent appeals for racial harmony and the end of segregation. Eventually, their tactics won victories in two very significant pieces of legislation. First was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or sex illegal, and then the second was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in the voting booth. Now, despite these legislative victories, the extreme toll on black Americans to continue bearing the heavy weight of nonviolent resistance was starting to show. And here's where I tell you that not all the black population agreed with the nonviolent tactics of the civil rights movement. So let me introduce you to Malcolm X. His main message was that King's vision for the integration of the races was a foolish quest. The way to freedom, rather, was separatism and even militarism. To that end, Malcolm X advocated countering white violence with black violence, and in this vein, black militants formed the Black Panthers, which advocated violence when necessary in defense of black rights. And all this tension exploded in 1965 when race riots broke out in Los Angeles after the arrest of a black motorist by white officers. And after the riot ceased, 30 people were dead and hundreds of buildings were destroyed. And over the next few years, the same kind of destruction spread throughout other American cities. All that to say, despite the huge gains made by the civil rights movement, America's race problem had not yet been solved. But that's where we'll leave that for now, because we do need to talk about the expansion of the civil rights movement to include other folks as well. Growing right along with the civil rights movement was a new era of women's rights, and giving voice to the movement was a popular book by Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique. In this book, Friedan explored the boredom and imprisonment of the typical housewife who was beholden to the needs of her family at the expense of her own needs. She argued that women should seek fulfillment in professional careers in addition to serving the needs of their families. And in 1966, Friedan was instrumental in the founding of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which advocated for women's rights using many of the same tactics the civil rights activists used to secure equal opportunity and pay for women entering professional careers. Now, one of the greatest almost achievements of the women's rights movement was the Equal Rights Amendment, which would amend the Constitution to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex. I say almost achievement because the amendment barely fell short of the necessary votes needed to become an amendment. This was in part due to a conservative backlash from people arguing for a more traditional lot for women, chief among them being Phyllis Schlafly. Also growing out of this expanded movement for civil rights was the demand for rights among the Latino, the American Indians, and the gay population. With respect to Latinos, we have to remember from the last period that Mexican workers were deported in huge numbers during the Great Depression. Many of them returned in the 50s and 60s, and their labor was exploited for very low wages. So boycotts and protests took place under the leadership of Cesar Chavez, and in 1975, these agricultural workers won collective bargaining rights to address that wage disparity. Moving on to the American Indian population, in 1968, the American Indian movement was founded, and their goal was to reclaim tribal traditions, achieve self-determination, and address the systemic poverty shared by many American Indians. One significant event in this cause was the occupation of Alcatraz Island. Now, Alcatraz was federal land that had been abandoned, and in an earlier treaty, it had maintained that abandoned federal land would be returned to the Indians. So the Indians occupied this island and claimed it as their own, but the occupation did end 19 months later when increasing federal pressure made it difficult to survive there. Even so, this event became a cornerstone for American Indian activism, which would eventually lead to the Self-Determination Act of 1975. And this law gave American Indians much greater control over their lands, their education, and law enforcement. All right, now we're going to talk about the gay liberation movement. For that, we need to go to New York City. In 1969, police raided a gay bar called Stonewall Inn because of anti-gay laws that were on the books. This kind of thing had happened before, but during this raid, the people resisted, and that spontaneous resistance led to more organized protests in the following months. Activists encouraged gay Americans to be open about their identity and work to end discriminatory practices and violence against the community. And their efforts paid off. Along with overturning anti-gay laws, in the 1970s, homosexuality changed status from a mental illness to a legitimate sexual orientation. Now, going on concurrently with all of this, in the 1960s was a movement dedicated not necessarily to gaining rights, but rather overturning cultural norms, and it was known as the counterculture. It was mainly a movement among young people who cast off societal restraint with rebellious styles of clothing, experimental drug use, and free love, which is exactly what it sounds like. And the greatest gathering of this movement was the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. And at this festival, 400,000 folks were in attendance to hear live performance of the musicians that gave voice to this cultural rebellion. Folks like Jimi Hendrix and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young and Joan Baez. But after that, the counterculture kind of fizzled out due to all their excesses, not to mention all their drug addictions. But even so, one aspect of counterculture did survive, and that was the change in many Americans' attitudes towards sexuality and sexual expression. Widespread use of birth control and antibiotics to treat STDs made casual sex with multiple partners the growing norm. All right, now before we get back to the Cold War, we need to pay a visit to the Supreme Court. Under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court handed down multiple decisions that expanded civil liberties, and I'm going to tell you about two of them. The first was Baker versus Carr in 1962. Now, in many states, at least one house of their legislature was heavily skewed in favor of the rural areas to the disadvantage of the urban areas. And given what I've already said about the middle-class flight from the cities, this was obviously done in service of racial discrimination. The decision by the court declared that this practice was unconstitutional and mandated that representative districts be drawn to include all members of the citizenry. The second case was Engel versus Vitale, which provided a further expansion of individual liberty. The decision, argued from the First Amendment, was that laws requiring Bible reading and teacher-led prayers in schools violated that wall of separation between church and states. Okay, and now back to the Cold War, and to get back into it, we need to talk about decolonization. So after World War II, there was a massive movement of decolonization around the world, and in the early wake of decolonization, many of these newly independent nations had unstable political and economic structures. Therefore, they needed aid, and as needers of aid, they became highly desirable assets in the growing conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. So let's look at three areas and how it all played out. First, in Latin America, we'll look at Guatemala. In 1954, the US led a coup to overthrow a socialist government that was encroaching on US business interests, and elsewhere in Latin America, the CIA planned assassinations of communist leaders like Fidel Castro. Now, that particular assassination failed, but it didn't matter because all this anti-socialist, anti-communist intervention into Latin America had the effect that you think it would have, which is to say, increased anti-American sentiment in the region. Okay, now moving on to the Middle East, specifically Iran, the CIA aided the Iranians in the overthrow of a socialist government that wanted to nationalize the country's oil supply. A new leader, the Shah, was installed and was sympathetic to American interests, and so he rewarded America with low oil prices and the purchase of massive quantities of arms. Okay, that was easy. No more problems in the Middle East after that. Over in Asia, let's go visit Indochina, otherwise known as Vietnam. It was previously a French colony, and when it was finally liberated, Vietnam was divided into North and South at the 17th parallel until an election could be held. But in the North, Ho Chi Minh established a communist government, while in the South, a democratic government was established. I think I see where this is going. Anyway, under the leadership of President Eisenhower, $1 billion in economic aid was given to the South in order to stabilize it economically. And Eisenhower argued that if South Vietnam fell to communism, then it'd be like a domino knocking down every other domino in the region, and soon every dang place in Southeast Asia would be communist. It was called the domino theory, and it made a lot of sense to Americans. So that's essentially where Eisenhower left the situation when his term ended, and in his farewell address, he warned against the impact of the Cold War, specifically the growing military-industrial complex. What he meant was that in the midst of this arms race with the Soviet Union, the U.S. was in danger of becoming a military state. Anyway, John F. Kennedy was elected next, and he agreed with the domino theory. Kennedy therefore increased the number of what he called military advisors that the U.S. sent into Vietnam. So what's a military advisor? Well, they were troops, but they were strictly there to support and advise the Vietnamese, not fight. Anyway, Kennedy went ahead and got himself assassinated in 1963, and then Lyndon Johnson becomes the president just as the situation in Vietnam is heating up. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to you to hear that the U.S. did start fighting eventually, but how did we get there? Well, a lot of it revolved around something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The story goes like this. Apparently, North Vietnamese ships fired on a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, that fact is highly disputed, but it didn't matter. Johnson used this as justification for U.S. military escalation in the region. I know what you're thinking. That sounds just like the USS Maine in the start of the Spanish-American War. Look at you drawing connections across periods. I'm so proud. Anyway, Congress basically gave Johnson a blank check in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to exercise whatever powers were necessary to protect American interests, which is to say democracy and capitalism in the region. So technically, America was about to get involved in a war for which Congress had never granted an official declaration, and this became a huge debate at home. Had the executive branch abused its power by conducting foreign policy with military action apart from congressional approval? Well, whatever the answer was, the fighting officially began in Vietnam, and for years, Johnson continued the escalation step by step, always believing that if he just put a little more pressure on the North Vietnamese, they would surrender. By 1965, nearly 200,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam, and it more than doubled over the next 2 years. And Americans were dying by the thousands, fighting for a cause that many of them did not agree with. And as Americans continued to die, the nation at home seemed to be coming apart at the seams. I mean, not only was the civil rights movement mobilized in full force, but intense anti-war protests were also erupting. And this was largely fueled by secrecy and the spread of misinformation coming from Johnson and the Pentagon regarding the war. Some Americans opposed the war because of the immense waste of lives and money it required to keep fighting. Like, don't we have our own problems to think about, like race and poverty? And this anti-war sentiment was particularly acute among college students who staged massive demonstrations because once they graduated, they were the ones who would be drafted and then sent to fight. Okay, but to be fair, despite all these criticisms of national waste and immorality abroad, Johnson did struggle to create what he called the Great Society back at home. It was basically an expansion on the social reforms introduced by FDR's New Deal, and one of the key tenets of the Great Society was what Johnson dubbed the war on poverty. 40 million Americans still lived in poverty during his administration, and Johnson aimed to do something about it. And because Congress was majority Democrat, they basically gave Johnson a blank check. One of the things he did with his blank check is create the Office of Economic Opportunity, which implemented self-help programs like literacy programs and vocational training for impoverished Americans. And when it came time to get elected, Johnson won handily, and he interpreted that as a mandate from the people to continue the advancement of the Great Society. And that's exactly what he did, so let's look at it. But like the New Deal, it's going to be impossible for me to name all the programs implemented in the Great Society, but let me name 3 of the most significant. Medicare was established, which provided health insurance to folks over the age of 65. Medicaid provided health insurance to those in poverty, and a new Immigration Act abolished immigration quotas. Now, like I said, I could keep going ad nauseum, but the point is this. The liberalism of Lyndon Johnson, which argued that societal ills could be corrected best by government action, reached its high point of efficacy and influence in the mid-60s. Now, President Nixon was elected in 1968 and would eventually end America's involvement in Vietnam. But a new conflict was brewing at home as American society was in the midst of a significant transition that would last until the end of the period. A recession began in the 1970s, which had the unique combination of inflation and economic stagnation, which appropriately was called stagflation. Nixon cut federal spending to try to remedy that, but it only led to an increased economic downturn. And as a result, the public's confidence in the government's ability to right the wrongs of society started to crack. And then to further erode confidence in the government, we got the Watergate scandal. Nixon was reelected in 1972, but after the election was won, it was discovered that men hired by Nixon's re-election committee were caught breaking into the Watergate office complex, which housed the Democratic Party's national headquarters. But no big deal, they were just caught attempting to steal sensitive documents and put wiretaps on phones, so, Now, at first, Nixon denied that he had any knowledge of the affair, like his hands clean. But after several months of investigation and the production of a secret tape recorder in the Oval Office that implicated him, it was clear that he was heavily involved. So as an impeachment trial for his removal became imminent, Nixon resigned the presidency. Now, before all that scandal, there was a larger battle going on in America between conservatism and liberalism, and the Supreme Court became a flashpoint for this debate. Nixon had the opportunity to appoint several judges to the Supreme Court, and being a conservative, he appointed conservative judges whom he assumed would hand down conservative opinions. Well, one of the most hotly debated cases in American society was argued during this period, and it was the case of Roe versus Wade. It was a decision about abortion and whether it was a constitutional right. Now, Nixon had done his job right. Conservatism abounds on the court, and yet the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the constitutionality of abortion in all 50 states. Now, one significant effect of all this is the large-scale fusion of evangelical Christians who opposed abortion and the Republican Party. Okay, and finally, we need to talk about the environmental movement gaining some traction during this period. There was growing concern over human damage done to the environment. Several large oil tankers had crashed and spilled their oil into the seas, and the massive environmental fallout of such disasters drove people to protest the harm that comes when human error and technology inevitably fail. And to that end, in 1970, Congress created a new agency, namely the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. It was a regulatory agency which sought to put limits on the environmental impact of industry on the land and the air and in the water. All right, that's Unit 8. If you got through it all with me, give yourself a high five. You deserve it. I'll see you in Unit 9.